The wind was a constant, cruel companion, whipping tendrils of straw-dry hair across her face, tasting of dust and desperation. Eleanor pressed a cracked hand against her belly, the hollow ache a gnawing emptiness that had long surpassed hunger and settled into a dull, continuous pain. Days bled into nights, marked only by the changing temperature and the slow crawl of the sun across an indifferent sky. Her wagon, or what was left of it, lay splintered and abandoned miles back, a monument to swift, brutal misfortune. A broken axle, a panicked team spooked by thunder that had promised rain but delivered only fury and dust. Then the creeping realization that help was not coming. Not ever. Her husband, gone a year now to a fever that stole him silently in the night, had been wrong. The promise of land, of a new life, had led her here, to this vast, flat expanse under an impossibly large sky, where the only inhabitants seemed to be the wind and the biting insects. Fear, cold and sharp, had been her first emotion. Now, it was a weary numbness, interspersed with flashes of raw terror when the coyotes yipped too close or the shadows lengthened into monstrous shapes. She hadn't seen another soul in what felt like an eternity. Water had been her most pressing concern initially, the small reserves dwindling fast. She had followed the faintest dry streambed, hoping it would lead to something, anything. It had led only to more dry earth, more cracked clay. Now, even the thirst felt distant, overshadowed by the profound weakness that settled deep in her bones. Her legs trembled with each step, her vision swam at the edges. She knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and oddly peaceful, that she was close to the end. The sun beat down relentlessly, bleaching the world white, the horizon a shimmering, unreachable mirage. She stumbled, falling to her knees, the impact jarring but barely felt through the layers of exhaustion. The ground was hard, unforgiving. She stayed there for a long moment, forehead resting on the sun-baked earth, drawing shallow breaths that did little to fill her lungs. Dust coated her tongue, her lips. She thought of her small cottage back east, the scent of damp earth after a spring rain, the familiar weight of a trowel in her hand. Simple things taken for granted. Now they felt like fragments of a different life, lived by someone else, somewhere far away. A fly landed on her cheek, and she lacked the energy to brush it away. It buzzed against her skin, a tiny, insistent annoyance in the face of her monumental despair. She closed her eyes, the world behind her eyelids a swirling darkness tinged with red from the pressure of the sun. Perhaps it would be quick, just drifting off like falling asleep. But a part of her, buried deep beneath the weariness and fear, refused to yield entirely. A flicker of stubbornness, inherited perhaps from generations of women who had faced hardship and endured. She had to try. One more step, then another. The thought was a tiny spark in the encroaching darkness. She pushed herself up, using her hands to steady herself against the ground, her muscles screaming in protest. Her knees were bruised and scraped. She didn't look back at the direction she had come. There was nothing there for her. Only the endless, flat prairie stretched ahead, shimmering in the heat haze. She began to walk again, a slow, shuffling gait, her tattered skirt catching on the brittle scrub brush. Each breath was a conscious effort, each movement a triumph over the inertia of despair. She didn't know where she was going. She only knew she couldn't stop. Not yet. Not while there was still a flicker of will left within her. The sky began to deepen to a bruised purple as the sun dipped low. No clouds, just the slow, inevitable march of twilight. The wind picked up again, colder now, carrying the scent of dry grass and something else, something wild and untamed. She hugged her shawl tighter around her shoulders, the thin fabric offering little protection against the dropping temperature. She needed shelter, water, food. Impossible demands in this desolate landscape. As the last light faded, painting the western sky in hues of orange and violet, she saw it. A thread of smoke, impossibly thin, rising against the vast canvas of the twilight sky, miles away, but undeniably there. It was a sign of life, a sign of humans. Hope, a dangerous, fragile thing, stirred within her chest. It was foolish, perhaps. Could be anyone. Could be danger. But the alternative was certain death. She changed direction, turning towards the smoke, her pace quickening fractionally, fueled by this new, desperate hope. The distance was deceptive. The twilight deepened into night, the prairie illuminated only by the faint glow of the stars and a sliver of moon. The smoke was gone now, dissipated into the night air, but she had marked its direction, a fixed point in her mind. She walked through the darkness, guided by instinct and the memory of that fragile plume. The ground was uneven, her progress slow and stumbling. She fell again, her ankle twisting with a sharp pain that stole her breath. Tears pricked at her eyes, not from the pain, but from the renewed wave of despair. She lay there for a long time, the cool night air against her face, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the prairie night, the rustling of unseen creatures, the distant howl of a coyote. She pushed herself up, gritting her teeth against the pain in her ankle. It was injured, but not broken. She could still walk. She had to. She would crawl if necessary. The thought of the smoke, the possibility of another human being, was a beacon in the darkness. She rose, favoring her injured ankle, and continued her slow, arduous trek across the dark, silent land. The stars above were impossibly bright, a million indifferent eyes watching her struggle. She felt utterly alone, a tiny, insignificant speck against the immensity of the universe, her fate hanging precariously in the balance. The night felt endless, a test of endurance that pushed her to the absolute limits of her physical and mental strength. Every muscle ached, her head throbbed, and the cold had seeped deep into her bones. She walked until her legs felt like lead, until the pain in her ankle was a constant, dull roar. Finally, as the sky began to lighten in the east, a faint gray wash promising the return of the sun, she saw something. A low shape against the horizon, indistinct in the pre-dawn gloom. It wasn't a rock formation. It had a definite structure. As the light grew, revealing the stark, flat landscape in shades of gray and brown, the shape resolved itself into a small, crude shelter, built low to the ground, almost swallowed by the prairie grass. And near it, the unmistakable shape of a man. He was sitting by a fire, a thin curl of smoke rising into the still morning air. He hadn't seen her yet. She stopped, hidden by a slight rise in the ground, her heart pounding against her ribs. Fear warred with relief. Who was he? Was he dangerous? Could he help her? Her throat was too dry to call out. She watched him for a moment, a silhouette against the growing light. He was still watching the fire, seemingly oblivious to his surroundings. Gathering every ounce of strength she had left, she took a deep, ragged breath and pushed herself forward, hobbling towards the faint promise of salvation. She emerged from the tall grass, a gaunt, tattered figure against the vast backdrop of the prairie. The man looked up then, his head snapping towards her with surprising speed. He didn't move, didn't call out. He simply watched her approach, his gaze unreadable across the distance. She kept walking, forcing herself onward, until she was only a few yards away. He was weathered, his face lined, his eyes sharp and intelligent, observing her with an intensity that was unnerving. He wore practical, worn clothing, buckskin and canvas. A rifle lay across his lap. He didn't reach for it, but its presence was a silent declaration. He said nothing, his silence amplifying the vulnerability she felt. Standing before him, exposed and desperate, she stopped, her injured ankle throbbing, her breath coming in short, painful gasps. The air between them crackled with unspoken questions. "Water," she finally managed, her voice a dry, croaking whisper. Please, the word felt immense, heavy with her need. He continued to regard her for a long moment, his gaze sweeping over her emaciated frame, her sun-scorched face, the tattered remnants of her dress. There was no pity in his eyes, only a quiet assessment. It was the look of someone who saw the world without sentimentality, who understood the brutal realities of survival on this land. He was lean and sinewy, his movements economical when he finally shifted. Without a word, He reached for a battered metal canteen resting near the fire. He uncorked it and extended it towards her. His hand was steady, calloused. She hesitated for only a fraction of a second, the instinct for self-preservation warring with her overwhelming need. Taking the canteen, her hands trembled. It was heavier than she expected, blessedly cool to the touch. She brought it to her lips and drank, slowly at first, then more urgently as the cool liquid soothed her parched throat. It was the most wonderful thing she had ever tasted. She drank until the immediate urgency subsided, lowering the canteen with a shaky sigh. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice slightly stronger now. He simply nodded, his eyes still on her. He gestured towards the fire with a slight inclination of his head. "Sit." His voice was low, quiet, rough-edged, like stones tumbled in a river. It held no warmth but no malice either. Just a simple directive. She sank gratefully to the ground, the small area near the fire offering a welcome respite from the chill morning air. The warmth seeped into her bones, chasing away some of the deep-seated cold. She watched him as he poked at the fire with a stick, his attention seemingly focused on the flames. Yet she felt his awareness of her, a constant, vigilant presence. "You're a long way from anywhere," he stated, still not looking at her. It wasn't a question. "My wagon broke," she managed, the words feeling inadequate to describe the catastrophe that had befallen her. "Lost everything." He nodded again, a slow, understanding movement. He didn't ask for details. He didn't offer platitudes. He simply accepted her statement of fact. He reached into a small canvas bag beside him and pulled out a strip of dried meat. He held it out to her. "Eat." She took it, her hand closing around the tough, dark jerky. Her stomach cramped at the scent, a sudden, sharp hunger replacing the dull ache. She tore off a piece with difficulty, her teeth struggling against the dried fibers. She chewed slowly, savoring the salt and the faint, gamey flavor. It was sustenance, pure and simple. He watched her eat, his expression still unreadable. He didn't eat himself. He simply observed. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the sounds of her slow, careful chewing. It was an odd, tense communion, two strangers brought together by chance in the middle of nowhere. She finished the jerky, her hunger only partially sated, but her body grateful for the nourishment. She looked at him, the early morning light illuminating the fine lines around his eyes, the slight stubble on his jaw. "My name is Eleanor," she said, feeling the need to offer something, anything, in return for his silent generosity. Eleanor Vance. He met her gaze, his eyes the color of prairie earth. "Kane," he replied, his name a single, stark word. No title, no explanation, just Kane. Suited him. He seemed a man stripped down to essentials, like the landscape around them. He pointed towards the horizon, where the sun was now beginning to rise, casting long shadows across the grass. "Smoke," he said, his voice quiet. "Tells stories." She frowned, confused. "Stories." He finally looked away from the fire, his gaze sweeping the horizon. "Where folks are coming from, where they're going, what they're doing. You read the smoke. It tells you." He spoke as if this were the most natural thing in the world. She had only seen the smoke as a sign of life, a beacon. He saw it as language. It was a strange concept, but looking at him, sitting there so attuned to the land, she had no doubt he meant it literally. "How did you?" she began, gesturing vaguely towards the sky where her own smoke had been. "Saw your smoke," he finished for her. "Thin, drifting, alone, moving slow. Told me someone was lost, in trouble." He hadn't waited for her to reach him. He had seen her need from miles away, conveyed in the fragile plume of smoke she had made the previous night from dry grass, a desperate signal she hadn't even realized she was sending. He had read it. He had understood. And he had waited. The realization sent a shiver down her spine, not of fear, but of something akin to awe. He saw the world in a way she couldn't comprehend, a world of subtle signs and hidden meanings. He was a part of this landscape, not just traversing it. He offered her more water, and she accepted, drinking more slowly this time. The stiffness in her ankle was worsening as the initial shock wore off, a dull ache intensifying with every movement. She must have winced, because Kane's gaze flickered downwards. "Ankle," he stated. "Twisted it," she confirmed, her voice small. Without a word, he rose in a single fluid motion. He moved with the quiet grace of a predator, sure-footed and economical. He knelt beside her, his movements deliberate. She flinched slightly, her instinct still wary, but his touch, when it came, was gentle, practical. He probed the swollen area around her ankle bone with firm but careful fingers. "Not broken," he pronounced, his voice flat. "Sprain. Needs rest. The word felt impossibly luxurious in this harsh environment. She hadn't had true rest in days. He reached into his canvas bag again, this time pulling out a length of clean strips of cloth. He began to wrap her ankle, his movements efficient and skilled. His hands were rough, the skin like leather, but his touch was surprisingly deft. He worked in silence, his brow furrowed in concentration. As he wrapped the cloth, securing it firmly, she watched him, noticing the small details, the network of fine lines around his eyes, the way a lock of dark hair fell across his forehead, the quiet intensity of his focus. He wasn't young, but he wasn't old either. A man weathered by the elements, hardened by life, but not broken. Once the wrapping was complete, he tied it off securely and sat back on his heels, regarding his handiwork. "Keep off it," he said. "As much as you can," she nodded, grateful. The binding provided support and a sense of stability. "Thank you, Kane," he simply nodded in response. He looked towards the rising sun, then back towards her. "Got food," he said, gesturing to his bag. "Water. Small fire. Won't last long for 2". It was a statement of fact, blunt and without apology. He wasn't offering permanent refuge, merely acknowledging the temporary reality. "I understand," she said softly. She did. He was a solitary traveler, perhaps a trapper or prospector, living off the land with minimal supplies. Taking on a passenger, especially one as ill-equipped and injured as she was a burden. "How far are we from anything?" she asked, the question hanging heavy in the air. "Days," he replied, his gaze sweeping the endless horizon. "Maybe a week. Depends which way you're going. Depends if you can walk." His assessment was bleak but realistic. A week's travel on foot with a sprained ankle with minimal supplies felt impossible. Despair, held at bay by the temporary relief of food and water, began to creep back in. He seemed to sense her renewed despondency. "You were heading west?" he asked. She nodded. "To find land. Start over." He was silent for a moment, considering her. "Hard country," he said finally. "Doesn't give up easily." He rose, moving towards a pile of dry brush nearby. "Need more wood." He began gathering fuel for the fire, his movements deliberate and unhurried. She watched him, thinking about what he had said. Hard country. It had already proven itself to be just that. She looked around at the vast, empty landscape, the sheer scale of it overwhelming. How had she ever thought she could conquer this alone? She had been naive, foolish, blinded by desperation and the false promise of a new beginning. Yet here she was, still alive, thanks to the silent, enigmatic man who could read stories in smoke. He returned with an armful of wood and added it to the fire, the flames licking eagerly at the dry branches. The warmth spread, a small circle of comfort in the immensity of the prairie. He settled back down, his gaze once again fixed on the fire. "You got anyone waiting?" he asked, his voice quiet. The question surprised her. It was the first hint of anything personal, anything beyond the immediate practicalities of survival. "No," she replied, the words small and hollow. "My husband passed last year. No family back east. No one here." She hadn't intended to share that, but the words had come out, carried on a wave of loneliness that still resided deep within her. He was silent for a moment, processing her words. He didn't offer sympathy, just a quiet acknowledgement. "Alone then," he said, a simple statement of shared reality. He was alone too, she realized. A solitary figure navigating this vast, indifferent land, communicating with the world through the language of smoke and signs. He didn't look like someone who belonged anywhere, but he belonged here, somehow intrinsically linked to the rhythms of the prairie. This land, she began, hesitant. It's unforgiving, he nodded slowly, his gaze distant, as if seeing something she couldn't. It takes, he agreed, takes everything if you let it, but it can also give, if you know how to ask. How did you ask the prairie for anything? It seemed a capricious, cruel entity. He didn't elaborate, leaving her to ponder his cryptic words. The sun was fully up now, casting a golden light across the landscape. The morning was silent except for the crackling fire and the distant cry of a hawk. She looked at the horizon, then back at Cain. He was her only hope, a stranger, a man of the wilderness, who had found her when she was at her lowest ebb. She didn't know if he would help her, if he could help her reach safety. But for now, in this small circle of firelight, she was not alone. And that, in itself, felt like a fragile beginning. The day passed in a quiet rhythm dictated by Cain. He was a man of few words, communicating mostly through gestures and brief, direct statements. He tended the fire, checked her ankle wrap, and scanned the horizon with an almost constant vigilance. He caught a rabbit mid-morning, moving with astonishing speed and silence. He cleaned and cooked it over the fire, sharing the meat with her. It was lean and tough but nourishing. She ate slowly, her stomach still adjusting to solid food. As she ate, she watched him, learning his habits. He moved efficiently, wasting no energy. He seemed acutely aware of his surroundings, his eyes constantly sweeping the landscape, his ears attuned to the faintest sound. He taught her how to identify water-wise plants, pointing them out with a lean finger. He showed her how to read the direction of the wind by the way the grass bent. He didn't lecture or explain at length, just demonstrated and stated simple facts. It was a different kind of learning, observational and practical. She found herself paying attention in a way she hadn't before, noticing the subtle shifts in the light, the distant calls of birds, the texture of the soil. He was a quiet teacher, and the prairie was his classroom. Her ankle throbbed constantly, forcing her to keep it elevated as much as possible. Moving was painful, even just shifting her weight. She spent most of the day sitting near the fire, watching Cain and the vast expanse of the prairie. He didn't push her to move. He seemed content to let her rest, his earlier statement about their limited supplies hanging in the air between them, a silent pressure. As the afternoon wore on, the heat became intense. The sun beat down from a cloudless sky, making the air shimmer. Cain moved their small camp to the scant shade offered by a low rise. He rationed the water carefully, giving her slightly more than himself. She noticed. He didn't comment on it. It was just something he did. The silence between them wasn't awkward, but it was heavy with unspoken thoughts and anxieties. She wondered about his past, about how he had come to live this solitary life, so deeply connected to the wilderness. But she didn't ask. Their relationship was built on necessity and cautious observation, not on shared histories. He seemed to exist entirely in the present, focused only on the immediate needs of survival. As dusk approached, the wind picked up again, bringing a welcome coolness. Cain began preparing for the night, gathering more firewood. "Coyotes," he said, pointing towards the west, where the sun was setting in a blaze of color. "Hear him closer tonight." His voice was matter-of-fact, not fearful, but she felt a prickle of unease. He built the fire up higher, the flames casting dancing shadows around their small camp. He checked the rifle, its metallic click sounding loud in the quiet air. He settled near the edge of the firelight, his back against a rock, his gaze fixed on the darkness beyond. She sat on the other side of the fire, wrapped in her shawl, the heat warming her front while the chill of the night crept up her back. The darkness of the prairie was absolute, broken only by the distant pinpricks of stars and the glow of their fire. She could hear the coyotes now, their yips and howls echoing across the vastness. They sounded closer than she had ever heard them before. She drew her knees up to her chest, feeling small and vulnerable. Cain remained still, a silent sentinel, his presence a reassurance. He seemed utterly unafraid, completely at ease in this wild, untamed world. She envied him that ease, that sense of belonging. She felt like an intruder, an alien presence in a land that rejected her. She thought about her husband again, about the life they had planned, the dreams they had shared, all turned to dust and broken wood on the prairie. A wave of grief washed over her, sharp and unexpected. She pressed her lips together, determined not to cry. Crying wouldn't help her here. She needed to be strong. She looked at Cain, his profile illuminated by the firelight. He was her lifeline. Without him, she knew she would have perished. The thought was a stark reminder of her dependence. It rankled slightly, this reliance on a stranger. She had always been independent, capable. But the prairie had stripped her of everything, including her self-sufficiency. She had to learn to accept help, to trust, even when every instinct screamed caution. The coyotes continued their chorus, their wild calls raising the hairs on her arms. Cain didn't react, his gaze unwavering. He was listening, assessing. He was a part of this night, attuned to its sounds and movements. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to find a semblance of peace in the heart of the wilderness. The fire crackled, a small, comforting sound. When she opened her eyes, Cain was looking at her. His gaze was steady, observant. He didn't speak, but there was a question in his eyes, a silent inquiry into her state of being. She offered him a small, weary smile. "Just thinking," she murmured. He nodded slowly. He seemed to understand. He didn't pry. He simply returned his gaze to the darkness. The night stretched on, long and silent except for the sounds of the prairie. She drifted in and out of a restless sleep, the hard ground uncomfortable beneath her, her ankle throbbing. Every time she woke, Cain was there, sitting upright, watching. He was guarding their small camp, protecting her from the unseen dangers of the night. It was an act of quiet, unwavering protection, offered without expectation or demand. The next morning, her ankle was still swollen and painful, but the wrapping seemed to help. Cain assessed it silently, his expression revealing nothing. "Still needs rest," he stated. He made no move to pack up their meager camp. He seemed resigned to staying put for a while longer. He spent the morning teaching her more about the prairie, how to distinguish edible roots from poisonous ones, how to find water sources hidden beneath the surface, how to read the direction of travel by the sun and the stars. He spoke sparingly, his instructions concise and practical. He didn't use fancy words or complicated explanations. He just told her what she needed to know to survive. She listened intently, soaking up every scrap of information. This knowledge felt more valuable than anything she had ever learned in a classroom. It was the language of the land, and he was teaching her to understand it. She found herself watching his hands as he demonstrated. His fingers calloused and strong, capable of tying a knot, cleaning a rabbit, handling a rifle with equal ease. They were hands that worked, hands that survived. He was patient in his own silent way. When she struggled to understand a concept or identify a plant, he would simply repeat the demonstration or point again, waiting for her to grasp it. There was no frustration in him, just a quiet perseverance. As they sat by the fire, she asked him about his life, tentatively, fearing a rebuff. "You live out here? Alone?" He was silent for a moment, considering her question. "I travel," he replied finally. "Follow the seasons. The game. Less trouble this way, less trouble than what?" She didn't ask. His words painted a picture of a solitary existence, beholden only to the natural world. It was a life of hardship, she knew, but also perhaps one of freedom. "It must be lonely," she ventured, feeling bold. He shrugged, a slight, non-committal movement. "Lonely is a choice," he said. The cryptic response hung in the air. She thought about it. Was being alone a choice? Or had life simply led him down this path? Had loss, perhaps, driven him to seek solitude in the vastness of the prairie? He offered her another piece of dried meat for lunch and some wild berries he had found. They were tart but juicy, a welcome change from the dry jerky. She ate them gratefully. "You saved my life, Cain," she said, looking at him across the small fire. It needed to be said, an acknowledgement of the immense debt she owed him. He met her gaze, his eyes steady. "Saw your smoke," he repeated, as if that explained everything. As if simply seeing a signal of distress was reason enough to intervene, to share his precious resources, to risk his own solitary existence. Perhaps, for him, it was, perhaps in this unforgiving land, the simple act of recognizing another human struggle was a call to action, a silent code of survival. She looked away, humbled by his understated response. He didn't see himself as a hero, just a man who had read a signal and responded. It was a stark contrast to the self-importance she had sometimes encountered in the settled world. In the afternoon, the sky began to change. Thin, wispy clouds appeared, gradually thickening and darkening. The wind intensified, blowing in gusts. "Storm coming," Cain said, his gaze fixed on the horizon. His tone was calm, but there was an urgency in his movements as he began to gather extra wood, securing their meager supplies. She watched the sky, a knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. She had already experienced the prairie's fury once. She didn't want to face it again, especially in her weakened state with an injured ankle. Cain finished his preparations and then knelt by her side, looking at her ankle. "Needs protection from the rain," he said. He looked around, then pointed towards the low rise nearby. "Small overhang there. Can shelter under it." He helped her up slowly, supporting her as she put weight on her injured ankle. Pain shot up her leg, but she gritted her teeth and bore it. Moving was difficult and slow. He didn't rush her, his grip steady and supportive. They made their way to the overhang, a shallow indentation in the rock face, barely large enough for two people to huddle beneath. It offered little in the way of comfort, but it would provide some protection from the elements. Cain quickly moved their supplies, the fire, and his rifle under the overhang. He settled himself near the entrance, his body a barrier against the wind. The first drops of rain began to fall, large and heavy, hitting the dry earth with a soft hiss. The scent of rain on dust filled the air. It was a smell she had longed for only days ago, but now, with the storm threatening, it felt ominous. The rain intensified, quickly turning into a deluge. The wind howled around the overhang, whipping rain and debris into their meager shelter. Thunder rumbled in the distance, growing steadily louder. Lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the landscape in stark, fleeting moments. She huddled back against the rock face, shivering despite the presence of Cain beside her. He remained still, his eyes scanning the storm-lashed prairie. He seemed utterly unbothered by the thunder and lightning, his calmness a strange contrast to the violence of the storm. She watched him, realizing how completely she was relying on him for her safety. He was her shield against the elements, her guide in this unfamiliar world. The storm raged for what felt like hours, the sound of the wind and rain deafening. She closed her eyes, trying to block out the noise and the fear. When she opened them again, the storm had begun to subside. The rain lessened to a steady drizzle. The thunder retreated into the distance. The air was clean and cool, washed of dust. The rain continued intermittently through the night, a gentle drumming sound against the rock. She slept fitfully, the cold seeping into her bones despite being sheltered. When she woke, the sky was a pale gray, the rain had stopped, and the prairie was transformed. The dry earth was dark and damp, the grass glistening with moisture. The air was cool and clean, filled with the scent of wet earth and growing things. Cain was already up, tending the fire. He looked towards the east, where the sun was attempting to break through the clouds. "Rain's good," he said, stating the obvious. "Good for the land, yes. Good for survival." He offered her water from the canteen, refilled by the storm. Tasted fresh and pure. Her ankle was still painful, but perhaps slightly less swollen. Moving was still difficult. "We should try to move today," she said, her voice hesitant. The thought of staying put, draining his supplies, felt wrong. He looked at her, assessing her injured ankle. "Slow," he cautioned. "Won't make much ground. But we have to try," she insisted. He considered her for a moment, then nodded slowly. "All right," he said. "But we go slow. You set the pace." It was a small concession, an acknowledgement of her need to contribute to their survival, to not be simply a burden. He packed up their camp with his usual efficiency. He helped her to her feet, steadying her as she gingerly put weight on her bad ankle. The pain was a constant companion now, a dull ache that flared with every step. They set off, heading west, following a faint game trail that Kane seemed to know instinctively. Their pace was agonizingly slow. Every step was an effort, a test of her endurance. Kane walked slightly ahead of her, his movements easy and fluid, occasionally looking back to check on her progress. He didn't offer to carry her, and she wouldn't have accepted if he had. She had to do this herself as much as possible. As they walked, she noticed the changes the rain had brought. Small puddles dotted the landscape. The grass looked greener, less brittle. The air felt alive. Kane pointed out fresh animal tracks in the damp earth, signs of deer and other creatures. He showed her how to follow them, how to read the story they told of movement and direction. He was teaching her to see the prairie not as an empty void, but as a living, breathing entity, filled with life and hidden pathways. The miles passed slowly, marked by her increasingly heavy breathing and the throbbing in her ankle. She stumbled often, and each time, Kane was there, a steady hand reaching out to steady her, never letting her fall completely. He didn't offer words of encouragement, but his quiet, unwavering presence was a powerful support. They stopped frequently to rest, finding what little shade they could. During these stops, Kane would tend to her ankle, checking the wrapping, gently probing the area. He would offer her water, a piece of jerky. Their interactions remained sparse, functional. Yet, within that sparsity, a quiet connection was forming, forged in shared hardship and silent mutual respect. He respected her effort, her determination to keep going despite the pain. She respected his strength, his knowledge, his quiet kindness. As the sun began to set, painting the western sky in hues of gold and crimson, they stopped to make camp. They had covered perhaps only 5 or 6 miles, a meager distance in the vastness of the prairie. But it was progress. "Find a place for the night," Kane said, gesturing towards a small cluster of rocks that would offer some shelter. While she rested her ankle, he set about making a fire, his movements as efficient as ever. As the fire grew, casting its warm glow, she watched him, a sense of gratitude swelling within her. He had every reason to leave her, to conserve his resources and travel alone. But he hadn't. He had chosen to help her, a complete stranger. "Why?" she asked him quietly, breaking the silence. He looked up from the fire, his eyes meeting hers across the flames. "Why what? Why did you stay? Why are you helping me?" The question hung in the air, the unspoken "you don't owe me anything" implicit. He was silent for a moment, considering his answer. He looked away, his gaze drifting to the horizon, where the last light of day was fading. "Saw your smoke," he said again, his voice low. "Wasn't just lost. Was alone. Dying." He turned back to her, his gaze steady. Saw that it was the most he had said at once, a simple, profound explanation. He had seen her desperation, her vulnerability, her aloneness, conveyed in that fragile plume of smoke. And he had responded. It wasn't about obligation or reward. It was about a recognition of shared humanity in the face of overwhelming odds. He saw her not as a burden, but as a life needing saving. The simplicity of his answer, the quiet depth of his observation, touched her deeply. It stripped away all the complexities and pretenses of the world she had known and revealed a fundamental truth. In the wilderness, survival was a community effort, even if that community was just 2 souls against the immensity. A feeling of profound respect for this man, This solitary figure who lived by a code she was only just beginning to understand, settled over her. He wasn't just a tracker who could read smoke. He was a man who saw, truly saw, the quiet suffering of another, and chose to act. Days blurred into a routine dictated by the sun, the pain in her ankle, and Kane's quiet guidance. They walked in the cool mornings and evenings, resting during the heat of the day. Her ankle slowly improved, the swelling gradually reducing, though the ache remained. She learned to walk with a limp, adjusting her gait to minimize the pain. Kane continued to teach her, pointing out landmarks, identifying animal trails, showing her how to forage for edible plants. He taught her how to build a small, smokeless fire, essential for remaining unseen. He taught her to listen to the sounds of the prairie, to distinguish between the innocent rustling of grass and the movement of something larger, potentially dangerous. She was becoming more attuned to the world around her, her senses sharper, her awareness heightened. She still felt like an outsider, but less so than before. The prairie was no longer just a terrifying, empty space. It was a complex ecosystem, a place with its own rules and rhythms, and she was slowly learning to navigate it. Their conversations remained sparse, primarily focused on practicalities. Yet, in the long silences, in the shared watching of the sunset or the quiet tending of the fire, a bond deepened between them. It wasn't born of shared laughter or easy conversation, but of mutual reliance, unspoken understanding, and a growing respect. She saw his patience, his quiet strength, his deep connection to the land. He saw her resilience, her determination, her willingness to learn and adapt. He never asked about her past, about the life she had lost. He seemed to understand that dwelling on the past was useless in this world. The present and the immediate future were all that mattered. One evening, as they sat by the fire, he pointed to a distant range of low hills on the horizon. "That's the edge of it," he said, his voice low. "Civilization. Small town past those hills. Trading post." The words sounded alien after weeks of wilderness. Civilization. People. It should have filled her with relief, with eager anticipation. But a strange sense of apprehension mixed with her hope. The world of people felt complicated, unpredictable, perhaps even more dangerous in its own way than the wild she was beginning to understand. And the thought of leaving Kane, of separating from this man who had become her quiet anchor, filled her with an unexpected sadness. He didn't say when they would reach it, just that it was there. A goal visible on the horizon. As they drew closer to the hills over the next few days, the landscape began to change subtly. The ground became more uneven, with more rocks and gullies. The vegetation changed, with more scrub brush and sparse trees appearing. They saw more signs of human activity, old wagon tracks, remnants of long-abandoned campsites, though no people. Kane grew more cautious, his vigilance increasing. He avoided the most obvious trails, sticking to higher ground where he could survey the landscape. "Got to be careful near settlements," he warned. "People are unpredictable." More than animals, his words resonated with her. She had experienced human cruelty and indifference in her life. The prairie, for all its harshness, felt simpler, more honest in its dangers. One afternoon, as they were making their slow way across a rocky hillside, Kane suddenly stopped, holding up a hand. She froze, her heart pounding. He lowered himself into a crouch, pulling her down beside him. He pointed to a thin thread of smoke rising from a gully below them, much closer than the smoke she had made weeks ago. The smoke was different, darker, thicker. "What is it?" she whispered. "Campfire," he murmured, his voice low. "But the smoke. Wrong kind of wood maybe. Or too much smoke. Fast fire. Careless." He was reading the smoke again, discerning details invisible to her untrained eye. He scanned the area around the smoke, his eyes narrowed in concentration. He was silent for a long moment, listening, observing. "3 horses," he said finally, his voice barely audible. "Tethered down there." And he paused, his body tensing. More than one man can feel it. He didn't need to see them. He could feel their presence, their energy. "Who are they?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Trouble, he stated flatly. Don't move. Don't make a sound. He shifted, slowly and silently, moving his rifle into position. His body was still coiled, ready. She huddled beside him, trying to make herself invisible against the rock. Her injured ankle was forgotten in the sudden surge of adrenaline and fear. She listened, straining to hear anything over the wind. She could hear nothing but the pounding of her own heart. The air was thick with tension. Kane remained utterly still, his gaze fixed on the gully below. He was a part of the landscape, blended into the rocks and brush, a silent hunter. He was protecting her, she realized, putting himself between her and whatever threat lay below. This quiet act of bravery, this willingness to face danger for her, solidified the trust that had been building between them. He was no longer just her rescuer, her guide. He was her protector. The silence stretched, taut and unnerving. She didn't know what he was waiting for, what he was planning. She put her hand, trembling slightly, on his arm. His muscle was like stone beneath her touch. He didn't flinch, didn't look at her. His focus remained entirely on the potential threat. She felt a surge of something fierce and protective towards him in return. She was weak, injured, but she would not be a liability if she could help it. She would follow his lead, do exactly as he said. The minutes crawled by, feeling like hours. The sun was starting to dip towards the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows. The dark smoke from the gully continued to rise, a sign of unseen activity. She held her breath, waiting. Kane finally shifted, moving with the same silent grace. He didn't stand up. He began to move laterally, along the hillside, staying low, using the rocks and brush for cover. She followed his lead, crawling and scrambling after him, her ankle protesting with every movement. But the pain was a distant concern now, overshadowed by the immediate threat. They moved slowly, deliberately, putting distance between themselves and the gully. Kane guided her through the rough terrain, his hand reaching back occasionally to help her over a particularly difficult patch. He moved with an absolute certainty, navigating the hillside as if he had walked it 1,000 times. She trusted him implicitly now, following his lead without question. After what felt like an age, they reached a point where they could descend into a shallow ravine that would provide more cover. The descent was tricky, especially with her injured ankle, but Kane was there, supporting her weight, guiding her steps. Once they reached the bottom of the ravine, they continued moving, keeping the rocky wall between them and the gully where the dark smoke rose. The ravine floor was uneven, filled with loose rocks and thorny bushes, but it offered concealment. They moved in silence, the only sounds the rustling of their clothes against the brush and the occasional scrape of a boot on rock. Kane stopped frequently, listening, scanning the rim of the ravine above them. He was like a finely tuned instrument, sensing the presence of danger. As the light faded, they found a small, sheltered alcove within the ravine walls. "We stop here for the night," Kane whispered, his voice barely audible. Too risky to move in the dark. Too close to what? The men in the gully. The implication hung heavy in the air. He didn't make a fire. Any light, any smoke would give away their position. The night was cold and silent, except for the distant howl of a coyote and the chirping of crickets. They ate cold jerky and drank sparingly from the canteen. She huddled beside Kane, the silence between them different from the companionable quiet of the previous nights. This silence was tense, watchful. He sat upright, rifle across his lap, his eyes scanning the dark rim of the ravine. He seemed alert, ready for anything. She lay beside him, listening to his steady breathing, finding a strange sense of security in his proximity, even in the face of danger. She knew he would protect her, that he would fight for her if necessary. The knowledge was both comforting and terrifying. The events of the day, the sudden threat, had jolted her out of the weary numbness she had been feeling. Fear was a sharp, present reality again. But it was mingled with something else, a surge of determination, a refusal to be a victim, a fierce protectiveness towards the man who had saved her. She was no longer the helpless woman who had stumbled across the prairie, waiting to die. She had learned, she had adapted, she had survived. And she would continue to survive for herself and for Cain. She watched his silhouette against the star-filled sky. This man who had emerged from the wilderness to offer her his last rations, his knowledge, his protection. He was a man of action, of quiet strength. His worth measured not in possessions or status, but in his ability to endure, to read the world, to survive, and to offer a hand to another lost soul. The night was long and tense. Sleep was a luxury she couldn't afford. She stayed awake, listening, watching, her senses heightened by fear. Cain remained a silent sentinel, his presence a quiet reassurance in the darkness. As the first hint of dawn lightened the sky, he finally stirred. "Light's coming," he whispered. "Time to move." Before they do, they rose silently, stiff from the cold night. Her ankle ached, but she ignored it. The need for escape was paramount. They moved quickly, silently, scrambling up the side of the ravine, using the pre-dawn gloom for cover. They climbed towards the higher ground, towards the low hills that marked the edge of the prairie. Their movement was swift and focused, adrenaline pumping through her veins. They reached the crest of the hill just as the sun was breaking over the horizon. Below them stretched the prairie they had just crossed, vast and empty in the morning light. And behind them, nestled in the gully, the source of the dark smoke. From their vantage point on the hilltop, they could see more clearly now. There were 3 men in the gully, rough-looking figures gathered around a campfire. They were saddling horses, preparing to move. Cain studied them for a moment, his gaze sharp and assessing. "Outlaws," he stated flatly. "Seen their kind before. Robbing folks on the trail. Lucky we stayed hidden, lucky." The word felt inadequate. It wasn't luck. It was Cain's knowledge, his vigilance, his ability to read the signs and react. He had kept them safe. He didn't linger, didn't gloat. His focus was already on their next move. "We need to get over those hills," he said, gesturing towards the range in the distance. "Fast." Before they head this way, the hills looked steeper than she had imagined, the terrain rugged and challenging. But the alternative, staying put or moving across the open prairie, was clearly more dangerous. They began the ascent, moving cautiously, using the rocks and sparse trees for cover. The climb was difficult, testing her strength and her still-healing ankle. The pain was intense now, a burning ache with every step. But she pushed through it, focusing on the goal, reaching the other side of the hills, reaching safety. Cain climbed ahead of her, his movements strong and steady, occasionally stopping to offer a hand or point out the easiest path. He never complained, never showed any sign of fatigue. He was a creature of the wilderness, built for this kind of hardship. As they neared the summit, they heard sounds from below, the distant shouts of men, the whinny of horses. The outlaws were moving. They were heading in their direction. Fear surged through her, sharp and cold. Cain heard it too. His pace quickened, his grip on her hand firm as he pulled her up the final stretch of the slope. They scrambled over the crest of the hill and paused, dropping to their knees behind a cluster of rocks, catching their breath. They were now on the reverse slope, hidden from the outlaws below, but they were exposed to the vast landscape on the other side. And in the distance, a faint thread of smoke rose against the sky, the settlement. "They'll cross the ridge soon," Cain said, his voice low and urgent. "Need to move." He looked back towards the way they had come, then towards the direction of the settlement. A decision had to be made. They couldn't outrun the outlaws on foot, not with her injured ankle. He could perhaps try to lead them away, create a diversion, but it would mean leaving her. He looked at her, his gaze intense. For the first time, she saw a hint of something other than stoicism in his eyes, concern. Maybe even fear, not for himself, but for her. "Can you move faster?" he asked, his voice quiet. She shook her head, tears of pain and frustration pricking at her eyes. "I can't," she whispered. "I'm sorry, Cain. I'm slowing you down." He didn't respond with anger or blame. He simply looked at her, his mind working. Then, a faint sound reached them, carried on the wind from the direction of the settlement. The distant sound of hoofbeats, and another, fainter plume of smoke, rising higher, different from the outlaw's smoke. "Someone's coming this way," Kane said, his voice gaining a note of urgency. "Riders. Looks like." More than 1 inch he studied the distant smoke, reading its story. Moving fast. Purposeful. Could it be help? Or more trouble? He had to decide. He looked back at the ridgeline behind them, then at the smoke ahead. The outlaws would be on the ridgeline soon. They were trapped between the known threat and the unknown riders. Kane made his decision. He pulled her to her feet. "This way," he said, gesturing down the slope towards the settlement. We moved towards them. Anyone coming from the settlement is better than those 3-inch. They began to move down the rugged slope, picking their way carefully through the rocks and brush. Every step sent a jolt of pain up her leg, but the fear of the outlaws behind them propelled her forward. Kane stayed by her side, guiding her, steadying her. As they descended, the sounds of the outlaws behind them grew louder. Shouts, the pounding of hooves on the rocky ground. They were on the ridge. They were coming over. Kane pushed her gently but firmly ahead of him. "Go," he urged. "Keep moving. Don't stop." He fell back slightly, pulling his rifle up. He was preparing to cover their retreat, to face the outlaws if they appeared. "Kane, no!" she cried, stopping, reaching back for him. "Go with me. They'll see 1 target easier than 2, he said, his voice firm. "Go. Get to the riders." He gave her a small push, urging her down the slope. Reluctantly, tears streaming down her face, she turned and continued her descent, her heart in her throat. She stumbled down the rocky slope, her ankles screaming in protest, adrenaline fueling her movements. She could hear the sounds of pursuit growing closer behind her, and the sounds of the approaching riders ahead. She was caught between 2 forces. She glanced back up the slope. Kane was silhouetted against the sky, rifle raised, facing the ridgeline. He was buying her time. She had to reach the riders. She had to bring help. She pushed herself harder, ignoring the pain, her eyes fixed on the distant, life-giving smoke. As she emerged from the roughest part of the slope and onto slightly less treacherous ground, she saw them. 3 riders approaching at a fast pace, still some distance away, but clearly visible against the landscape. She waved her arms frantically, shouting, her voice raw and hoarse. "Help! Over here! Help!" The riders saw her. They slowed their pace, changing direction, heading towards her. Relief washed over her, so powerful it threatened to buckle her knees. She was safe. Almost. She turned back to the slope, her gaze fixed on where she had last seen Kane. The sounds of the outlaws were closer now. She saw movement on the ridgeline, figures on horseback. They had spotted Kane. The outlaws spotted Kane. They spread out, dismounting quickly, taking cover among the rocks. They knew Kane was armed. A standoff. She was halfway down the slope, the riders approaching, still a few hundred yards away. She couldn't leave him. He had risked everything for her. She wouldn't abandon him now. She turned back towards the slope, ignoring the pain in her ankle, starting to hobble back up towards him. "Eleanor." "No." Kane's voice, sharp and urgent, reached her. He had seen her turn back. "Go. Get to the riders." "Not without you," she screamed back, her voice defiant. He swore, a short, harsh sound. The outlaws began to advance, using the terrain for cover, firing occasional shots that echoed through the hills. Bullets ricocheted off the rocks near Kane. He returned fire, his shots measured and accurate. He was outnumbered, outmaneuvered. She reached a cluster of rocks partway up the slope, taking cover, trying to assess the situation. The riders were closing in, but they were still too far away. Kane was pinned down. She saw him dive behind a larger rock as the outlaw fire intensified. She needed to do something. She couldn't just hide and watch. She looked around frantically, her eyes searching for anything that could help. She saw it, a pile of loose rocks near her. Small, easily moved. An idea, reckless and desperate, formed in her mind. It was something Kane had taught her, in a different context, how to use the environment to her advantage. "Distraction," Kane had said. "Sometimes all you need is a moment, she began to push the rocks. Small ones at first, then larger ones, rolling them down the steep slope towards the gully where the outlaws were partially exposed. The rocks gathered speed as they rolled, creating a small cascade, a rattling, echoing sound that drew attention. "Hey!" she heard one of the outlaws shout. Their fire towards Cain lessened slightly as they looked towards the source of the noise. It was a small diversion, perhaps only for a few seconds, but it was enough. Cain seized the opportunity. He broke cover, not retreating down the slope towards her, but moving laterally, scrambling quickly along the ridgeline, using the uneven terrain to make himself a harder target. The outlaws turned their fire back on him, but he was moving fast, low to the ground. At the same moment, the riders reached the base of the hill where she was. They were armed, cowboys from the settlement, alerted perhaps by Cain's signal smoke or simply patrolling the area. "What in God's name?" one of them shouted, seeing her. Then the outlaws on the ridgeline, then Cain scrambling along the top. "Outlaws!" she screamed, pointing towards the ridge. "They've got a man pinned down up there." The cowboys reacted instantly. They were clearly experienced. Two of them dismounted, taking cover, preparing to lay down, suppressing fire. The third, a younger man, stayed mounted, rifle ready, scanning the ridge. "Stay here, ma'am," one of the dismounted cowboys shouted to her. She nodded, huddling behind her rocks, watching the scene unfold. The cowboys opened fire on the outlaws on the ridge, their shots pinning the bandits down. This gave Cain the opportunity he needed. He reached a point on the ridgeline where the slope became steeper, dropping sharply down the other side. With a final look back, he disappeared over the crest. He was using his knowledge of the terrain to escape, to put the hill between himself and the outlaws. The cowboys continued firing, keeping the outlaws engaged. The third rider, seeing Cain disappear, shouted, "He's gone over the other side, probably heading for the settlement." He spurred his horse, beginning to ride around the base of the hill to cut Cain off or meet him on the other side. The outlaws, realizing Cain had escaped, were now focused on the cowboys below. A firefight erupted, shots echoing through the hills. She watched, breathless, the sounds of battle filling the air. She was safe now with the cowboys, but her heart was pounding for Cain. Had he made it? Where had he gone? The fight didn't last long. The outlaws, outnumbered and exposed, quickly realized they were in a losing battle. They mounted their horses and retreated, riding hard back across the prairie, away from the hills. The cowboys held their fire as the outlaws rode off into the distance, not pursuing them. They knew better than to chase bandits into the open prairie. The two dismounted cowboys rose, checking their rifles. "Damn fools," one of them muttered, shaking his head. The third rider returned, his horse blowing hard. "Saw him," he reported. "He's heading down the other side towards the trading post. Looks like he knows the way." Relief, so profound it made her knees weak, flooded through her. He was safe. He had made it. The cowboys turned to her, assessing her with professional, curious eyes. "You all right, ma'am?" the older one asked. She nodded, managing a shaky smile. "Yes," she said. "Thanks to him." Cain, she looked back at the ridgeline where he had stood his ground, protecting her. The cowboys exchanged glances. "Cain, you say?" the younger one said. "Know him? The tracker? Read smoke." It seemed Cain's reputation, or at least his skill, was known even here. "He saved my life," she stated simply. The cowboys nodded, accepting her words without question. They saw the state she was in, the tattered clothes, the obvious hardship she had endured. They helped her down the rest of the slope, supporting her as she favored her injured ankle. The walk to the settlement, a small collection of buildings huddled near a water source, felt both long and short. Long because of the pain in her ankle and her exhaustion, short because she was walking towards safety, towards people. When they reached the trading post, a rough-hewn building that served as general store, post office, and meeting place, several people came out to greet them, their faces a mixture of concern and curiosity. They were the people of the settlement, the edge of the civilization Cain had spoken of. They offered her water, a place to sit, asking questions about what had happened. She recounted her story, briefly, focusing on the broken wagon, the lost supplies, the weeks alone on the prairie, and finally, being found by Cain. She explained about the outlaws and how Cain had protected her. As she spoke, she looked around, searching for him. He wasn't among the small crowd. "Where is he?" she asked, her voice tight with anxiety. "Cain? He came through maybe 15-20 minutes ago." The trading post owner, a stout man with a friendly face, replied. "Said he needed to get moving. Headed out west again. Didn't stay long, headed out west again." Just like that. He hadn't waited for thanks. He hadn't stayed to see her safe in the settlement. He had simply done what he did, saved a life, read the signs, and moved on, returning to the solitude of the prairie that was his home. A pang of disappointment, sharp and unexpected, struck her. She had wanted to thank him properly, to see him safe, perhaps even. She didn't know what, but he was gone, back to the vast, silent world from which he had emerged. The people of the settlement were kind, offering her food, clean water, a place to rest. They were practical, asking about her needs, arranging for her care. But she felt a strange sense of dislocation, of being between two worlds. The world of people, with its rules and expectations, and the world of the prairie, where survival was paramount and a man could read stories in smoke. She looked back the way she had come, towards the low hills, towards the endless expanse of grass and sky. Out there, somewhere, was Cain, alone but not lonely, moving through the landscape with a quiet purpose. She thought about his words. Lonely is a choice. Perhaps he was right. Perhaps he had chosen this life, this connection to the land over the complexities of human society. She spent the next few days in the settlement, resting, allowing her ankle to heal. The people were welcoming, offering her odd jobs in exchange for room and board. She worked in the trading post, cleaning, sorting supplies, listening to the conversations of the settlers and travelers who passed through. She heard stories of hardship, of lost wagons, of encounters with outlaws, and occasionally, whispers about the solitary tracker who roamed the prairie, a man named Cain who knew the land like no one else. She listened, realizing that her story, while personal and devastating, was not unique. The prairie took its toll on everyone who dared to challenge it. But she had survived, and she had changed. She was no longer the fearful, naive woman who had set out alone. She had seen the harshness of the world, but she had also seen quiet courage, resilience, and the unexpected kindness of a stranger. She had learned to read the sky, the wind, the subtle signs of the land, lessons taught by a man who saw the world differently. Her ankle healed slowly, a physical reminder of her ordeal. But the deeper transformation was within her. The fear had not disappeared entirely, but it was tempered by a newfound strength, a quiet confidence in her ability to endure. She found she didn't yearn for the life she had lost as intensely as before. The prairie, which had nearly broken her, had also forged something new within her. She had faced her own mortality and survived, not through her own strength alone, but through the help of another, a reminder that even in the most desolate places, connection could be found. One evening, sitting outside the trading post as the sun set, she saw a distant plume of smoke rising from the west. It was thin, steady, purposeful. She watched it, a small, knowing smile touching her lips. Cain. He was out there, moving through the vastness, reading the signs. She thought about the life he led, solitary and hard, yet somehow free. She thought about his quiet strength, his unspoken code, his ability to see the world with a clarity that had saved her life. She knew she might never see him again. He was a man of the prairie, bound to its rhythms, not to the settled world. But his lessons, his quiet protection, the simple act of offering his last rations to a dying stranger, these things would stay with her. They had fundamentally changed her, showing her a different way of being, a deeper understanding of resilience and connection in the face of adversity. She was no longer defined by her loss or her vulnerability. She was a survivor, and she carried within her a piece of the prairie, and a piece of the man who had taught her to live in it. She wouldn't seek him out. His path was his own. But she would never forget him. And she would live the life he had given her, with the quiet strength and resilience she had found on the vast, beautiful, unforgiving prairie. The settlement offered a temporary haven, a place to recover. But she knew this wasn't her destination either. She had come west seeking a new beginning, and while the original path had been destroyed, the desire remained. She would stay long enough to regain her strength, to fully heal her ankle, to earn enough to equip herself properly. And then she would set out again. Not west perhaps, but somewhere. Somewhere she could use the strength, the knowledge, the resilience she had gained. She would carry the lessons of the prairie with her, the understanding that survival wasn't just about enduring hardship, but about reading the world, about connecting with its rhythms, and about the quiet power of human connection, even in the most desolate of places. The prairie had taken much from her, but it had also given her something invaluable. A new sense of self, forged in the crucible of hardship, tempered by the quiet strength of a man who could read stories in smoke. Her journey was not over. It was just beginning. And this time, she was not the same lost soul wandering blindly towards her end. She was a woman who had seen the edge of despair and found her way back, guided by the silent hand of a stranger, transformed by the wild, beautiful, and brutal heart of the land. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues. The first stars began to appear. She looked out at the vast, darkening prairie, no longer with fear, but with a quiet respect. It was a harsh land, but it was also a land of immense beauty and unexpected grace. She was ready, and so, Eleanor stayed in the settlement, working, saving, her presence a quiet testament to resilience. Her limp faded, her body regained its strength, but the stillness in her eyes, the way she scanned the horizon, remained. She carried herself with a quiet dignity, a woman who had faced the abyss and returned. She learned the ways of the settlement, the rhythms of life at the edge of the wilderness. But she never felt entirely a part of it. A piece of her remained tethered to the vast open spaces, to the silent language of the wind and the sky, to the memory of a solitary figure who had shown her how to truly see. She heard occasional mentions of Cain, whispers of sightings far out on the prairie, stories of his skill and his solitary nature. He remained a figure of legend, a ghost in the grass. She never tried to find him, understanding that his world was not hers, not in the way that mattered for his existence. Their paths had intersected, dramatically, fatefully, and then diverged again, leaving her forever changed. When the time came, when her ankle was fully healed and she had saved enough money, she purchased a sturdy horse, supplies, and a good rifle. The trading post owner, Mr. Abernathy, watched her preparations with a mixture of respect and concern. "You heading out again, Eleanor?" he asked, his voice kind. She nodded, securing a saddlebag. "Yes, Mr. Abernathy. Time to find my place. It's a hard country out there, especially for a woman alone," he cautioned gently. She met his gaze, a quiet confidence in her eyes that hadn't been there when she first stumbled into his settlement. "I know," she said, "but I'm not the same woman who came here." She mounted her horse, the feel of the reins familiar in her hands. She had learned to ride in the settlement. She looked back at the small collection of buildings, the people who had offered her refuge. She was grateful, deeply grateful, but this was not her end. She turned her horse towards the west, not towards the same destination that had claimed her husband and her wagon, but towards the vast, open country, towards the horizon. She knew it would be difficult. She knew there would be challenges, dangers, but she also knew she was capable. She had faced the worst and survived. She carried the lessons of the prairie within her, how to read the land, how to listen to the silence, how to find strength in unexpected places, and how the simple act of human connection, offered in the face of utter despair, could be the most powerful force of all. She thought of Cain, somewhere out there, moving through the endless grass. He had saved her life, taught her to see, and then let her go, back into the world with a new understanding. She was no longer Eleanor Vance, the lost widow. She was Eleanor, a woman of the prairie, forged in its heat and wind, resilient and free. As she rode away from the settlement, leaving the last vestiges of settled life behind, she looked back one last time. Then she turned her face to the west, to the vast, empty, beautiful horizon, and rode forward, a solitary figure against the immensity, ready to face whatever the prairie held, no longer afraid, but alive with the quiet determination of a survivor. And so she rode. Days melted into weeks, the prairie stretching out before her, a sea of grass under an endless sky. She traveled with caution, applying the lessons Cain had taught her. She chose her campsites carefully, built small, smokeless fires, listened intently to the sounds of the wind and the animals. She learned to find water in the dry season, to identify edible plants and roots. She was alone, yes, but she was not lonely. She was connected to the land in a way she had never imagined possible. The vastness no longer felt terrifying, but awe-inspiring. She was a small part of something immense and ancient, moving through its rhythms. She encountered other travelers occasionally, solitary trappers, small groups of prospectors, the occasional homesteading family pushing west. She was cautious in her interactions, trusting her instincts, remembering Cain's warning about people being unpredictable. Some were kind, some were wary, some were indifferent. She relied on herself, on the skills she had acquired. One evening, camped alone under a sky ablaze with stars, she saw a distant plume of smoke, impossibly thin, rising from the south. She watched it for a long time, reading its story. It was moving slowly, deliberately, alone. She smiled, a quiet, knowing smile. Somewhere out there, moving through the vastness under the same endless sky, was the man who had taught her how to see. He was still out there, a part of the prairie, a legend in the grass. Their paths might never cross again, but his presence, his quiet strength, the indelible mark he had left upon her life, remained. She was no longer lost. She was found by the prairie itself, by the lessons it held, and by the silent, extraordinary man who had opened her eyes to its language. She banked her small fire, settled down for the night, the vast silence of the prairie wrapping around her like a familiar blanket. She was home, in a way she had never been before, ready for whatever the dawn might bring.